What happens when State Representative Zohran Mamdani, sharp as ever, is asked about Mayor Eric Adams' obsession with him on live TV? One single line from Mamdani had the audience on their feet, the host doubled over, and the internet on fire. You could almost feel the pause in the room before it happened. A late-night New York audience, buzzing with curiosity, leaned forward in their seats as the host leaned in with a grin, waiting for Zohran Mamdani's response. The question on the table: Mayor Adams' latest swipe at the progressive movement in the state of New York City politics. Everyone knew Mamdani was quick on his feet, but no one expected what came next. When he finally opened his mouth, a single line came out, short, cutting, and hilarious. Within seconds, the studio burst into uncontrollable laughter. The host's face turned red, the cameraman struggled to keep steady shots, and millions watching at home would later replay the clip on loop, sharing it across every corner of social media. That was the moment Zohran Mamdani didn't just answer a question, he stole the night. But to really understand why that one line hit so hard, you need to picture the scene before the explosion. The studio wasn't a stiff political setting. It was warm, laid back, and set in a repurposed Brooklyn warehouse on a Thursday night. The crowd was lively, clapping through the commercial breaks, waiting for the promised surprise that the host had teased earlier. When Mamdani walked out from backstage, the applause wasn't polite. It was the kind that shakes the system. People were standing, some cheering like they were at a concert, phones raised high trying to capture the young state rep cracking one of his trademark smiles. He didn't rush. He took his time, waved, shook hands with the host, and sat down with a confident ease that showed he was comfortable under the lights. The host, Jason McCready, a comedian known for mixing humor with sharp politics, wasted no time. He leaned across his desk with a mischievous smirk and said, "So I don't know if you've heard, but Mayor Eric Adams had some pretty colorful words about your wing of the party this week." The audience laughed immediately. It was the kind of laugh that said, "We can't wait to see where this goes." Mamdani chuckled quietly, his eyes narrowing slightly, like he was setting up a chess move. Jason kept pushing. He said, and I quote, that progressive socialists are the worst thing to happen to New York City since the 70s. Now, Mr. Mamdani, I think he owes an apology to Studio 54, but what do you make of that? The line was ridiculous, but it framed the moment perfectly. The laughter rippled through the room, but everyone wanted to hear what Mamdani would say. Mamdani leaned back, calm as ever, adjusting his collar like he had all the time in the world. He didn't fire back right away. He let the silence work for him, letting the anticipation stretch until the audience grew quiet, waiting. You could hear someone cough in the back row. Then Mamdani tilted his head, smiled faintly, and spoke in the quick, rhythmic cadence people recognized from his speeches. "Well," he said, "I suppose if we're the worst thing to happen to New York, then Mayor Adams must be the best thing to happen to late-night comedy. Folks gotta thank him. He's been giving you material for free." It was simple, it was direct, and it detonated the room. The crowd broke. People were clutching their stomachs, slapping their hands against their seats. Jason dropped his pen and doubled over, his laughter cutting through his microphone. Mamdani didn't move. He just raised his eyebrows as if to say, "What, did I lie?" That one-liner was so sharp, so unexpected that it instantly became the headline. Viewers at home tweeted it within seconds, and even before the commercial break ended, clips of the moment were trending. But the power of that moment wasn't just in the joke, it was in the delivery. Mamdani knew how to use the pause, how to build tension, then break it in a way that felt effortless. That's why it worked. It wasn't cruel or mean-spirited, it was funny in a way that turned the entire room against the mayor's position without Mamdani even raising his voice. And in today's climate, where every word gets dissected, the fact that a single quip could make such a splash was remarkable. For the audience in Brooklyn, it wasn't just another late-night taping. They were part of something that felt bigger than television. They were eyewitnesses to the kind of moment people text their friends about the second they walk out of the studio. By the time the cameras cut to a commercial, people were still laughing, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. But the real shock came later when people realized just how fast that moment would ripple through the country, spreading from television to phones to dinner tables in a matter of hours. If you've ever been to a live taping, you know there's a certain electricity in the air. But that night, inside the studio in Brooklyn, it felt different, like something unpredictable was about to happen. The seats were packed, the stage lights gleamed, and even before Mamdani walked in, people were whispering, passing guesses back and forth about what he might say if Adams' name came up. Some were fans of late-night comedy, some were longtime DSA supporters, and a few had just come for the free tickets. But together they formed an audience that felt like a character in itself, ready to laugh, yipa, and roar on cue. The set itself was striking but comfortable. A sleek desk for Jason McCready, two chairs angled slightly toward each other so conversations felt close and personal, and the backdrop of the Williamsburg Bridge glowing with studio lights. The cameras glided silently from side to side, red lights blinking each time a new shot was live. From the moment Mamdani stepped out, the room transformed. Even people who weren't politically inclined stood to their feet, clapping and cheering as though a famous rock star had just entered. Jason couldn't resist breaking the tension as the applause stretched on. He leaned into his mic and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you do realize he's not running for mayor yet, right?" The joke landed perfectly. Mamdani laughed along, holding up his hands as if to calm the crowd. It wasn't forced. It was that natural charisma he carried, the kind that energized rallies and union halls. Once the noise died down, Jason leaned forward. "All right, Zohran, let's get right into it. You've been very vocal at the state level, but some people say progressives have been too quiet on the city front. Meanwhile, your old rival, Mayor Adams, he's been saying a whole lot. Any thoughts?" That line was bait, and everyone knew it. You could hear a few chuckles from the front row, like they knew they were about to witness a highlight. Mamdani didn't rush. He folded his hands, gave Jason a sidelong glance, and replied smoothly, "Jason, if I responded to every one of the mayor's comments, I'd need a permanent desk on this show." The audience erupted again. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Mamdani delivered them, calm, but with the sharp edge of a seasoned debater and a twist of humor that cut through the noise. Jason nearly fell out of his chair, covering his face with his cue cards. "See, this is what I mean," Jason shouted over the applause. "You give me one line, and I could cancel my writing staff for a week." The crowd laughed louder, but Mamdani just sat back smiling as if he had said nothing extraordinary. That was his weapon, precision. He never looked like he was trying to humiliate anyone. He just laid out a point so clearly that his opponent's position looked absurd. Then came a moment that made the room lean in even closer. Jason shuffled through his cards, pretending to pick a safe question, then stopped. "Okay, but seriously," he said, "Mayor Adams has been talking a lot about the city's problems. He keeps bringing your name up, blaming the DSA for everything from the housing crisis to, I don't know, the slow G train. Do you feel like he's running against you instead of running the city?" The way Jason framed it put Mamdani in a corner. Either he dodged or he faced it head on. The silence stretched, and people were practically holding their breath. Mamdani tilted his head and gave a sly smile. "Jason, Eric Adams has been running against somebody his whole career. The problem is he keeps changing who his opponent is. First Republicans, now socialists." He paused for the perfect beat. It seems like the only person he hasn't tried running against is himself. That did it. The roar that followed felt like it might blow the roof off. People clapped so hard it echoed. Jason slapped his desk, pointing at Mamdani as if to say, "There it is, the knockout." Even the band in the corner was laughing, some of them holding their instruments mid-note. But in the middle of the chaos, there was something fascinating about how Mamdani stayed collected. He wasn't showboating, wasn't leaning into the applause. He just sat back and waited for the laughter to die down. He'd played this game before. He knew timing wasn't just about the punchline. It was about letting the crowd breathe, then pulling them back in. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. You could tell they knew the clip they were capturing would be replayed endlessly. Even the security staff at the edges of the room cracked smiles, some shaking their heads like, "Yep, that's Mamdani for you." Jason, trying to regain control of his own show, finally lifted his hands. Okay, I have to ask this. When you prepare for moments like this, do you write these lines down ahead of time? Or did they just pop into your head? Mamdani chuckled, leaning toward the microphone. Jason, if you think I sit at home practicing comebacks for Eric Adams, you've got the wrong guy. He paused, eyes glinting. That's his job. He seems to have a press conference for everything. The laughter was so loud this time the band actually started playing over it, trying to keep the rhythm of the show moving. The host threw his head back, his laughter almost drowned out by the cheering. But while the audience thought they'd already heard the best moment of the night, the real highlight, the line that would dominate headlines, was still waiting just around the corner. Jason McCready knew he had something special brewing. There was a rhythm to his conversation with Mamdani that was different. Each exchange felt sharp, effortless, like a tennis match where one player was holding back just a little to keep it entertaining. The audience could sense it too. They were leaning forward, hungry for the next swing. Jason shuffled his cards again, partly for effect and partly to buy himself a moment. He glanced at the camera, raised his eyebrows, and turned back to Mamdani. All right, he said, lowering his voice slightly. Let's stop dancing around it. Mayor Adams has been making headlines every other day. He's called housing activists radicals. He's called the DSA a fringe movement. And last week at a press conference in the Bronx, he went as far as to say if the city were run by Zohran Mamdani, it would be unsafe and unlivable. What do you make of that? The room instantly shifted. The laughter cut off like someone had hit a switch. People still smiled, waiting, but now they were quiet. They wanted to hear the answer. This wasn't small talk anymore. This was the heart of the matter. Mamdani didn't respond right away. He tapped his finger against the arm of his chair, leaned back slightly, and exhaled as though weighing how much he wanted to give. Jason, he said slowly, I've learned something about the mayor. He says a lot of things that sound tough for the cameras. But when you look at the policies, who gets the tax breaks, whose rent goes up, the facts usually tell a different story. The audience clapped, though softly this time, almost out of respect for the tone. Jason leaned forward, not letting up. So, if you had gone head-to-head with him in the mayoral race, what do you think would have happened? Mamdani raised his eyebrows. Well, he said, pausing for just a beat, the first thing is, New Yorkers made their choice. But if the mayor's asking, I'll answer. Elections in this city aren't won with tough talk and galas with real estate developers. They're won by talking to tenants in the Bronx, by fighting for better subways in Queens. They're won with a real vision for the working class. The crowd burst into cheers, loud and sustained, and Jason slapped the desk like a gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, he said dramatically, case closed. But Mamdani wasn't done. He leaned in closer, almost conspiratorial, and added, now I'll admit, if it had been me up there, the mayor would have had one big advantage. He stopped, letting the suspense hang in the air. Jason squinted, caught off guard. What's that? He asked. Mamdani grinned amid. He wouldn't have had enough material for his attack ads. He's been running against people like me his whole life, and after all these years, he's still losing to the same ideas. The eruption was immediate and deafening. People shot out of their seats. Jason laughed so hard he slapped the desk twice more, and then stood up, pacing the stage like a coach after a game-winning play. Oh my God, he shouted, that's brutal. The camera panned across the audience, people wiping tears from their eyes, couples clutching each other's arms, some pointing at the stage like they'd just seen a historic knockout. Jason returned to his chair, still shaking his head. You realize, he said between laughs, that clip just got me 1 million views before the show even ends. Mamdani chuckled and shrugged. Happy to help your ratings, Jason. But the host wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward again, looking at Mamdani like a man searching for treasure. Let me ask you something. Does it bother you? The constant jabs, the obsession, the way the mayor keeps pulling your movement into everything. This time, Mamdani grew serious. He clasped his hands, looked straight at Jason and then at the audience. Look, politics in this city is noisy. People say a lot of things to get attention. But here's the truth. Leaders should be focused on people's lives, not their own press clippings. If all you've got after years in office is complaints about the activists fighting for their neighbors, then maybe you're in the wrong business. The applause wasn't raucous this time. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind that carries weight. People nodded, some standing to clap, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Jason nodded too, his grin fading into something more thoughtful. That's actually a great point. So what do you say to people who feel like the city is just stuck in this endless back and forth between City Hall and the progressives? Mamdani looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but firm. I'd say this: stop waiting for Mayor Adams or me to fix your problems from the top down. Focus on your neighbors, your tenant union, your community board, because that's where real change happens. Personal rivalries in the New York Post make headlines, but they don't stop an eviction. They don't fix the heat in your building. They don't make the subway run on time. And at the end of the day, people want results, not a grudge match. The audience erupted again, this time with a standing ovation. Jason held up his hands, trying to calm them down, but it was clear the room had been shaken in a different way. It wasn't just about laughs anymore. It was about truth. But as powerful as that moment was, nobody expected what Mamdani was about to deliver next, the one-liner that would turn into a viral thunderbolt across the nation. The moment had ripened. You could almost sense it, the air thick with anticipation, the audience perched at the edge of their seats. Jason McCready, grinning like a man who'd stumbled onto television gold, could tell something sharper was still sitting on Mamdani's tongue. It was the kind of silence before a comedian drops the line that no one sees coming. Jason leaned across the desk. Okay, Zohran, I have to ask. You have handled this like a pro, but people at home are begging me to push you harder. They want to hear what you really think about Mayor Adams and all this constant noise he makes. So, if he were sitting in that chair right now, what would you say to him? The audience gasped and laughed at the same time. It was the kind of daring question everyone wanted asked, but didn't think Jason would have the nerve to say out loud. Mamdani leaned back, crossed his legs, and gave a familiar half smile, the one that usually came before he delivered a blow disguised as humor. Well, he said slowly, if the mayor were sitting here, I'd probably tell him to take a breath. I mean, he spends more time talking about socialists in Astoria than he does talking about the billionaires on Park Avenue. He let that sink in. At some point, you gotta wonder who he's really fighting against. Us or the Democrat he used to be. The studio exploded. Jason doubled over, pounding his desk with both fists. Audience members stood up, some spinning around to laugh with strangers. The band started riffing spontaneously, as if they were scoring the punchline. Mamdani didn't laugh at his own joke. He just shrugged, palms up as though he'd simply pointed out something obvious. That contrast, the seriousness of his delivery against the hilarity of his words, made the line land like a hammer. Jason, wiping tears from his eyes, tried to recover. Oh my God, wow, I don't even think Saturday Night Live could have written that. Mamdani chuckled softly. That's the thing about the mayor. He's his own material. You don't have to write the jokes. He delivers the setup and punchline himself at every press conference. The audience roared again, but this time the laughter carried an edge of catharsis. It wasn't just funny, it was a release. People in that studio had lived through years of bitter political fights and exhausting debates. Hearing Mamdani cut through all of it with one clean slice felt like someone had finally said what they were all thinking. Jason, never one to miss a chance to stretch a bit, leaned forward again. Okay, but what if the mayor hears this clip, and you know he will, and he fires back? What then? Mamdani tilted his head, his expression playful but confident. Then I'll know he was watching. And honestly, if I can keep him focused on me for a night, maybe the city's tenants and essential workers get a little peace and quiet. That line landed like a second knockout. The laughter swelled so loud the floor seemed to vibrate. Jason pushed himself away from the desk, standing up and pacing with his hands on his head. This is insane. You're roasting him harder than my writers ever could. Mamdani raised his eyebrows. I'm not roasting him, Jason. I'm just telling the truth. It's not my fault the truth sounds like a joke. The crowd howled. The cameraman zoomed in on Mamdani's face. That calm composure against the storm of laughter around him, capturing the exact image that would be screenshotted and shared across social feeds before the night was even over. Jason finally sat back down, trying to collect himself. You know, Zohran, I don't even think you realize how funny you are. Like, do you ever think about doing stand-up after politics? Mamdani chuckled. I'll leave that to the professionals. Besides, if I started telling jokes full-time, the mayor would probably try to get me rezoned. That was it. The audience cracked open like a dam. People stomped their feet, clapped until their hands turned red, shouted from the back rows. The band launched into an upbeat riff just to keep the energy from exploding into chaos. Jason leaned back, threw his cards into the air, and shouted, "Good night, everybody! We've peaked!" Of course, the show wasn't over, but the energy in that studio had shifted completely. What began as a typical late-night interview had transformed into something raw, unpredictable, and unforgettable. Mamdani wasn't just answering questions, he was orchestrating the room, controlling the timing, pacing, and punchlines like a seasoned performer. For those watching live, it felt surreal. This wasn't scripted television. This was lightning captured in real time. But the biggest laugh of the night, the line that would go down as the knockout heard across the country, hadn't even been delivered yet. It was still coming, and when it did, it would shake more than just that studio. It would dominate the national conversation. The night had already been electric, but what happened next would elevate it from memorable to unforgettable. The cameras zoomed in tighter, the studio lights seemed brighter, and every single person in the audience leaned forward, waiting. Even Jason McCready, who thrived on improvisation, could feel that Mamdani was circling something big, something that would break through the chatter of late-night banter and stamp itself into the headlines. Jason, sensing the moment, steadied himself. He leaned across his desk, lowering his voice as though trying to extract the deepest secret from a friend. "Okay," he said, "we've danced around this long enough. Let's get real. You've talked about the mayor's obsession with you, you've joked about his comebacks, but if you had to sum it up, his whole fixation, the way he keeps your movement's name in his speeches, his interviews, what would you say to him? What's the one thing you'd want him to hear?" The room fell silent. You could hear the faint shuffle of someone adjusting their seat, the creak of a camera crane pivoting into position. Mamdani leaned back, eyes narrowed slightly, and then leaned forward again, clasping his hands. His pause was deliberate. He wanted the weight of the question to settle before he answered. Finally, with perfect calm, he said, "Well, Jason, if the mayor's still talking about our movement this much after all these years, maybe we aren't the political opponents he wants to replace." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for one perfect second. "Maybe we're the principled stand he wishes he could have taken." The eruption was immediate and volcanic. The audience screamed. People stood, some bent over clutching their knees, others waving their hands in disbelief. Jason launched himself out of his chair, stumbling backward with his mouth hanging, open. Hands pressed against his head, like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. The band tried to cover the noise with a spontaneous riff, but it was no use. The room had detonated into chaos. Mamdani didn't crack a smile. He sat still, composed, almost statuesque, letting the laughter swallow the room. That was the brilliance. He didn't need to laugh at his own line, because the delivery was so sharp it carved through the air like glass. Jason finally found his voice. "Oh my God, did you hear that? Did everyone hear that?" He pointed at Mamdani, pacing the stage like a man trying to process a miracle. You just destroyed him. Completely destroyed him." The cameras cut to the audience. A group of college kids in the front row were jumping up and down, slapping each other's shoulders. An older couple near the back leaned against each other, tears of laughter streaming down their cheeks. Even the producers off stage were caught wiping their eyes. Some nearly doubled over. Mamdani raised one eyebrow almost playfully and added, "Look, I'm just saying, if you keep talking about a political movement every single week, at some point people are going to start wondering if you need them for your fundraising emails more than they need you." Another wave of laughter tore through the room, louder and more sustained than the last. Jason collapsed back into his chair, slapping the desk with his hand as if to ground himself. This is history. I don't even know what to say. That's going on my wall. Forget YouTube. Forget TikTok. I'm printing it out, framing it, and hanging it right here on this desk. The viral line was already more than just a moment. It was an event. People in the audience were fumbling with their phones, trying to capture the aftershocks, whispering to each other about how no one was going to believe them when they said they'd been in the room. And then came the part that cemented it. Jason leaned forward, still gasping from laughter, and said, "You do realize, Zohran, that whatever the mayor says next, no matter what it is, will never top that. He could hold a dozen press conferences, but that line, that's the headline." Mamdani finally smiled, just slightly. "Well, Jason, I've always believed that when politicians show you who they serve, you should listen. The mayor shows us every day. All I did was put it into words." The crowd cheered again, a mix of laughter and applause like waves crashing against a cliff. It was more than humor. It was catharsis. People weren't just entertained, they were relieved, energized, almost liberated by how directly and cleverly Mamdani had punctured years of noise with one scalpel-like phrase. What made it powerful wasn't just the jab at Adams, it was that it felt authentic. It sounded like something only Mamdani could say, with his trademark blend of wit, composure, and sharp precision. That's why the clip would spread like wildfire. As the roar in the studio lasted so long that Jason had to wave his arms to quiet the crowd, he shook his head, his cue cards scattered. "Zohran, I've been doing this show for 12 years. 12! And I don't think I've ever seen a studio react like this." Mamdani gave a slow, knowing smile. "Well, Jason, sometimes the truth just needs the right punchline." The bandleader shouted into his mic, "That wasn't a punchline, that was a knockout!" The audience cheered again. Jason turned back to Mamdani. "How does it feel? You know that line is already leaving this room. It's going to explode online before we even wrap." Mamdani shrugged lightly. "You know, Jason, when you're in this fight, you don't think about moments like this. You think about how people at home are feeling. If they laughed tonight, if they felt a little lighter for 5 minutes, then I did my job." The sincerity in his tone shifted the energy, and the audience fell into a quieter, more respectful applause. But Jason wasn't ready to let it go. "I gotta be honest, though, I've interviewed a lot of people who've taken shots at the mayor. Some do it clumsily, some just sound angry. But the way you do it, it doesn't even sound like an attack. It sounds like an observation. And somehow that makes it hit even harder." Mamdani chuckled. "Jason, you ever heard the phrase, 'speak truth to power'? Sometimes the truth delivered with a little humor can cut deeper than shouting ever could." The audience erupted again, the applause rolling like thunder. It felt like affirmation. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged frantic hand signals. One mouth to another, "We've got it. This is the clip." In the control room, one of them muttered, "This is going to break the internet." Jason tried to reel him back in. "Okay, so let's play this out. You know Adams is going to respond, soon. What do you think he'll say when he sees this?" Mamdani tilted his head, his grin returning. "Probably the same thing he always says, that the media is unfair, that the socialists are ruining the city. Maybe he'll hold a last-minute press conference at Gracie Mansion to announce a new initiative against, I don't know, bad vibes." But the truth is, Jason, when you're more focused on the activists in Queens than the people in public housing you're supposed to serve, you've already lost the argument. The crowd clapped hard again, their applause carrying an almost serious tone. It wasn't just humor anymore. It was truth packaged in a way people could digest. Jason looked out at the sea of faces, then back at Mamdani. "You realize," Jason said softly, "you just gave my entire audience exactly what they came here for. Laughter, truth, in a story they'll tell for the rest of their lives." Mamdani smirked, leaned back, and said, "Well, Jason, that's the least I could do. Besides, your ratings needed the help." The audience howled once more, Jason throwing his head back in laughter. "He's killing me. He's absolutely killing me." The show's floor manager waved frantically from the wings, signaling they had only 30 seconds before they had to cut to commercial. Jason, flushed and grinning, turned back to the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, stay right where you are, because when we come back, we'll try to recover from this absolute obliteration. The band struck up a funky riff as the cameras pulled back. Audience members whispered to each other as the applause faded, many pulling out their phones to text friends. They knew they'd just witnessed something destined to live far beyond that night. But what no one in that studio could have predicted was just how quickly the clip would spread once the world outside those walls got their hands on it. When the commercial break ended and the cameras faded out for good, the studio still buzzed. Audience members walked out into the Brooklyn night like they had just been part of a championship game. But the moment they pulled out their phones, the real spectacle began. Clips of Mamdani's one-liner were already circulating before the show officially wrapped. A student from NYU in the second row had recorded the exchange on her phone, posting it on TikTok with the caption, "Zohran just ended Eric Adams in 10 seconds flat." Within 20 minutes, the clip had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. The comments were pure New York. Adams's publicist just quit. He's not running for mayor anymore. He's running from Astoria. On X, formerly Twitter, political commentators scrambled. A journalist from the city tweeted, "Zohran Mamdani just reminded everyone why he's one of the sharpest debaters in Albany." Another from Gothamist added, "Sharp, calm, devastating, classic Mamdani." Memes popped up instantly. Split-screen photos of a scowling Eric Adams next to a calm Zohran Mamdani with the caption, "Talk to me when you've picked a side." Local news networks weren't far behind. NY1 cut into their late-night programming to replay the moment, the anchor struggling to keep a straight face. MSNBC ran the clip on a loop, breaking down Mamdani's delivery like it was game tape. The New York Post, meanwhile, scrambled for a response, its website running a headline that read, "Classless Zohran's cheap shot at Mayor Sparks' outrage." But even their own commentators couldn't stop smirking as they tried to downplay it. By the time morning hit, the video had climbed to the top of YouTube's trending page. One clip titled, "Zohran Mamdani Destroys Eric Adams with Savage Line on Live TV" had 3 million views before breakfast. Local podcasts scrambled to get emergency episodes out. A comedian in Austin tweeted, "Mamdani just took every NYC comics closer and dropped it at 11:15 p.m. on a Thursday." The speed was dizzying. Reddit threads swelled with comments dissecting every word. One user wrote, "Uhamai." He paused for 4 seconds. 4. That's why it hit like a freight train. Another replied, "Adams has the NYPD, Mamdani has timing. Guess which one works on TV?" Even late-night rivals picked it up. The next evening, Jimmy Kimmel opened his monologue with, "So I was going to tell an Eric Adams joke tonight, but Zohran Mamdani already did it better." For Adams supporters, though, it was chaos. On Facebook, conservative groups were furious, calling the line disrespectful. On X, Adams himself weighed in the next morning during an unrelated press event, stating, "While some people are making jokes for late-night TV, I'm focused on running the greatest city in the world." Totally staged audience. Sad. The comment, of course, was instantly clipped and mocked. One reply read, "The DSA lives rent-free in Adams' head, and he's still trying to raise the rent." Meanwhile, average New Yorkers were texting the clip to their friends, playing it in office break rooms, replaying it on the subway. A woman in the Bronx filmed her grandfather's reaction as he watched the clip on his iPad. He nearly fell out of his chair laughing. In Portland, a high school teacher said his students quoted the line so much he had to tell them to write essays about why humor can cut deeper than anger. What gave the clip staying power wasn't just that it was funny, it was that it felt authentic. Mamdani wasn't on stage with rehearsed lines or a teleprompter. He was sitting in a chair, calm as ever, and with one phrase, he turned years of political noise into a joke people could share in their group chats. That's why it spread so fast, because people wanted to laugh at something that felt true. Within 48 hours, the clip had racked up over 50 million views. Hashtags like #Zohran mic drop and #principled stand trended for days. Even celebrities chimed in. But as unstoppable as the internet storm seemed, everyone wanted to know the same thing. How would Eric Adams himself respond when the cameras were on and the crowd was his? By the weekend, the anticipation had reached a boiling point. Everyone knew the mayor wasn't going to let this slide, so he had built his image around being but a fighter who never backed down. So when word spread that he was scheduled to speak at a community event in Staten Island, the press descended in droves. They weren't there to cover policy, they were waiting for the comeback. The community hall buzzed with energy, with supporters waving flags and chanting. News cameras lined the back of the room, reporters clutching their microphones as if bracing for impact, and chanting in unison. News cameras lined the back of the room, reporters clutching their microphones as if bracing for impact. The atmosphere felt more like a sporting event than a political gathering. Everybody waiting to see how Mayor Adams would answer the blow Mamdani had landed. Backstage at City Hall, however, the mood wasn't quite as confident. Advisors huddled in tense conversations, some urging restraint, others pushing Adams to go harder than ever. According to one staffer later interviewed anonymously, the mayor was fuming the moment he saw the clip. He watched it multiple times on a loop, each replay stoking his anger. He thinks Mamdani embarrassed him in front of the whole city, the aide said, and the mayor hates nothing more than the idea of being laughed at by the progressives. When Adams finally appeared on stage at the PBA hall, the crowd erupted. He basked in it, clapping along with the chants, pointing out supporters in the audience, and taking his time at the podium. But when the noise settled, he wasted no time. "I watched this so-called joke that Zohran Mamdani made the other night," Adams said, his voice sharp and animated. "The fake news media is playing it like it's the greatest thing ever said in television history. Folks, it wasn't funny. It wasn't even close. Totally scripted, totally staged in some Brooklyn warehouse." The crowd booed loudly, some shouting insults about the DSA. Adams leaned into their energy. They had the audience stacked with radicals, with all the cameras ready, and they think they can make me the punchline. Let me tell you something. They're not laughing at me. They're laughing at you. They're laughing at the cops who keep this city safe, at the small business owners who work hard every day. Mamdani wasn't laughing at me. He was laughing at all of you who just want a safe, prosperous city. The line hit home with his bass. Chants of USA filled the hall, but behind the bluster, his irritation was still visible. His gestures were sharper, his pacing more restless. Even his closest supporters could tell the joke had gotten under his skin. Later that night, commentators pounced. On NY1's Inside City Hall, a panelist remarked, "Mamdani used humor to diffuse and disarm. Adams used anger to rally and defend. It's a tale of two New Yorks." The New York Post, while defending Adams, couldn't resist showing the original joke again, inadvertently giving it more airtime. On social media, the response was a mixture of mockery and defense. One viral tweet summed it up. "When Mamdani smiles, Astoria laughs. When Adams shouts, the whole city scrolls." Even some moderate Democrats quietly admitted it was a tough moment. A former City Hall strategist told a reporter off the record, "The mayor can handle attacks from the city council, but he's never figured out how to handle jokes. That's why the DSA gets under his skin so easily, because humor is something you can't fight with a press conference." Back at Gracie Mansion, aides reportedly tried to shift the mayor's focus, but he kept circling back to the clip, rattled by how quickly it had spread. Meanwhile, the original video continued its journey, reaching audiences who rarely followed city politics. TikTok creators who normally made dance videos were all reenacting it, keeping it alive in the cultural bloodstream. By Monday morning, the Mamdani moment wasn't just a clip on YouTube. It was a conversation happening in every corner of the 5 boroughs. At a classic diner in Queens, 2 retirees sat by the window. One, a retired transit worker named Sal, chuckled as he scrolled through his phone. "Listen to this," he said to his friend. He called them the principled stand he wishes he could have taken. "Ha!" He set the phone down and laughed. His friend Maria shook her head, smiling. "You know what makes it so good? He didn't even sound mean, just calm, like he was stating a fact." Across the city, a different scene unfolded inside a bar near a police precinct in Bay Ridge. A group of off-duty cops and local homeowners gathered around a TV. A middle-aged man grumbled, "That wasn't funny. He thinks he's clever, but all he's doing is mocking us." Another chimed in, "The media loves him because he takes shots at the mayor." But that joke wasn't about Adams. It was about all of us. Heads around the table nodded in agreement. In classrooms at a high school in the South Bronx, students laughed as they replayed the moment on their phones between classes. One government teacher admitted she ditched her planned lesson and instead asked her students, "Why do you think humor can cut deeper than anger?" The discussion lit up the classroom. In a midtown office building, employees crowded around a computer in the break room while someone replayed the video. The laughter was contagious. One woman whispered, "Oh, I usually don't care about politics, but that was hilarious." The line was so widespread that community leaders brought it up in subtle ways. In a Sunday sermon at a church in Dallas, the pastor joked, "Sometimes the best response isn't anger. It's wisdom wrapped in humor," like one young assemblyman reminded us this week. The congregation chuckled knowingly. It wasn't just political, it was cultural. But while many laughed, others expressed unease. On WNYC's The Brian Lehrer Show, a caller from the Upper West Side voiced her concern. "Sure, it was funny," she said, "but what does it say about our city when the biggest political moment of the week is a joke? Shouldn't we be talking about the housing crisis?" The host responded, "That's the power of humor. It captures attention. But yes, the question is, where do we go after the laughter?" Meanwhile, podcasts lit up. One popular NYC politics show split its panel evenly. Half applauded Mamdani for cutting through the noise. Half argued he'd fueled polarization. One panelist said, "Humor works because it feels true, but that truth can sting. And for some, it feels like humiliation." Another replied, "Or maybe it just exposed the insecurity that's been there all along." Even national outlets took notice. The Nation ran a headline, "Zohran Mamdani silences NYC's mayor with killer wit." A commentator in The Guardian remarked, "It shows how grassroots humor in American urban politics is becoming more powerful than traditional speeches." By Tuesday, the city was split. Those who laughed, replayed, and celebrated the line as a refreshing moment of honesty, and those who saw it as an insult aimed at their identity. And yet, both sides agreed on one thing. It was unforgettable. A professor of communication at CUNY was interviewed on PBS and put it this way: "Humor is dangerous because it bypasses logic. You don't argue with a joke, you either laugh or you don't. And when it lands, it can reshape the narrative in a way no policy speech ever could." That's why the clip didn't just live online. It echoed in living rooms, workplaces, and classrooms across the 5 boroughs. People who normally tune politics out found themselves laughing along, quoting Mamdani, and in some cases reconsidering how they viewed the entire political rivalry. But as the laughter spread, one question lingered. What did this moment actually reveal about leadership, communication, and the way New Yorkers respond to conflict? For all the noise that followed, millions of views, endless memes, angry press conferences, and roaring laughter, the heart of the moment came down to something much simpler. A joke, yes, but beneath that joke was a lesson about leadership, timing, and the way people respond when two very different personalities collide. Mamdani didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult with venom. He didn't try to win with volume. Instead, he used wit, calm, sharp, and disarming. And that struck a chord. It showed once again that humor has a power that outrage simply cannot match. You can argue with a speech, you can dissect a policy, but you can't argue with a punchline that makes the entire room laugh at once. For that moment, Mamdani controlled the narrative without forcing it. He made people laugh, and in that laughter, they recognized a deeper truth. Anger might stir up crowds, but humor connects people. Think about it. New Yorkers from wildly different backgrounds were reacting the same way. A grandmother in the Bronx laughed in her living room. A college student at Columbia sent the clip to her friends. Office workers in the financial district replayed it on their lunch break. That universality is rare. But there's another lesson buried here. It's about resilience. Adams responded with anger, trying to frame himself as the victim of mocking elites. Mamdani, on the other hand, showed that you don't have to swing wildly to land a blow. Sometimes you let patience, timing, and a little humor do the work for you. And that's a lesson anyone can take into their own lives. How many times do we face conflict and think the only option is to shout louder? But here was a demonstration that calmness, even playfulness, can dismantle hostility more effectively than anger ever could. That's why the moment resonated. It wasn't just about politics, it was about life. It also reminded people of something they'd forgotten. Politics doesn't always have to be exhausting. It doesn't always have to be dark or bitter. Sometimes it can be human. Sometimes it can even be funny. For just a few seconds, laughter replaced division. Of course, the clip didn't erase the city's political divides. Adams' supporters still felt insulted. Critics of Mamdani still rolled their eyes. But what it did do was highlight how much people crave authenticity. The reason the joke landed wasn't because it was rehearsed. It was because it felt real. It sounded like something he thought of in the moment, and people believed it. In today's media world, where so much feels fake, authenticity is magnetic. That's the real legacy of that night. Not just a viral clip, not just a headline or a meme, but a reminder that humor, authentic, thoughtful humor, still matters. It can cut through the noise, disarm the anger, and leave people with something to remember. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Whether you're sitting across from a political rival, arguing with a coworker, or dealing with family tensions, sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't shouting, it's humor. Sometimes laughter is the bridge that words can't build. So yes, the world will remember that line as the night Zohran Mamdani roasted Eric Adams with humor. But maybe the real target wasn't the mayor at all. Maybe it was aimed at the bitterness, the heaviness, the constant fighting that drags people down. For one night at least, humor cut through, and people felt lighter. And that's why people are still replaying it, still quoting it, still smiling when they think about it. Because it reminded them that even in the chaos of politics, there's room for humanity. There's room for wit. There's room for something other than anger. If you take anything away from the story, let it be this. Don't underestimate the power of humor. Don't underestimate the calm voice in a loud room. And don't forget that sometimes the most powerful line is the one that makes people laugh and think at the same time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more moments that peel back the curtain on politics, humor, and the lessons hidden in both, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, there are plenty more stories worth telling, and you won't want to miss them.